This is Ted Whitten, and I'm going to talk about my method of doing 2D to 3D image conversion. This will be sort of a rough recap of the workshop that I did at the NSA convention in Irvine this year. And I'm just going to kind of do a quick overview of the method that I use. While there are other conversion methods, and it seems like pretty much everybody who does image conversion has a slightly different method. This is what I do or have done up to this point. It's an evolving thing. Gradually I learn more and more, pick up tips from other people and incorporate them into my method. And so this is what I've pretty much done up to this point. Some people will do depth maps, and depth map is when you paint a version of an image that is all black and white or grayscale, and everything in this image will perfectly overlay to your original photo or image, but you have to paint it manually, every element, every object and portion of an object with a scale, a shade of gray running from black to solid white, with one representing the foreground, either black or white, doesn't matter, and the other representing the distant background, and just gradually select everything and paint it or fill it in, sometimes with gradients. And that image then becomes what we would call a depth map, which is essentially a key that software, either Photoshop or Stereo Photo Maker or similar programs, can use to do the shifts for you. It applies the depth map, knowing that the black is the foreground, the white is the background, and vice versa, and the various shades of gray tell it where things fall within the depth space and therefore how much shift to give each element. Depth map conversions, I've tried a number of them, and personally I find it frustrating how much of a mess they make to the image and how much touch-up work is required afterwards. Sometimes they are beautiful and yield absolutely smooth, beautiful results, but ultimately I've figured out for my own purposes that I probably will only use depth maps on portions of an image, elements within an image that I'm converting, and then incorporate it back in. You do the rest of the conversion with pixel shifts or select and shift method that I'm going to be explaining. And there are other methods as well. Brian Wallace came up with a very unique method of using the cloning brush within the Stereo Photo Maker program. There's also what you might call perspective warping, where you you select an area and then grab the corners to stretch or skew the shape or dimensions of that, and can thereby create what the alternate eye might have seen, the different angle of an object that the other eye might have seen. Ultimately, the good conversions, the best conversions, are going to be incorporating more than one method. Your goal would be ultimately, over time, to learn as many different methods of conversion as possible and be able to recognize when doing a conversion which elements of the image are going to be most appropriately converted using which method. Some objects you might want to use a depth map on. Certain things you might want to do perspective warping or skewing, and sometimes doing pixel shifting, selecting and shifting, what I call depth slicing. Excuse me. So getting back to my method, I refer to this as depth slicing or pixel shifting, or the select and shift method, because essentially it's a very manual method where everything is gradually selected and then shifted. The goal in doing a conversion is to create a second eye perspective. You're starting with an image, could be a drawing, could be a piece of artwork or a photograph. Usually for me it's a photograph, and I treat that original image as the right eye. Some people will treat it as the left eye, but for me it's the right eye, so that's the way I'm going to be explaining this. And I make a copy of it and do all my work, all my selecting and shifting, etc., to the copy, which ultimately becomes the left eye image, and then you have a left eye and a right eye representing hopefully a rough representation of what the left eye and right eye would have seen had this actually been something that you saw in 3 dimensions or a 3D photograph that was taken with 2 cameras. I'm going to use a program here called Adobe Photoshop Elements. I'm working on a Mac, so my apologies to those of you on a PC, but these commands that I'm going to be explaining will be on a Macintosh. Now, I also have the full version of Photoshop, which I pay about $10 a month to use, but Photoshop Elements is much cheaper. It's a program that you buy outright. I think it's around $60 to $80, and it's essentially a stripped down version of Photoshop. It doesn't have nearly all of the features, but it does so much that at least in terms of everything I'm going to be explaining to you today, I believe, can be done in Photoshop Elements. So I'm going to use that. That might be a program that you will want to pick up if you don't have it. It is available for both Mac and PC. And to open an image, I'm going to do Command, meaning I'm going to hold down the Command button on the keyboard and tap the letter O. That brings up the Open dialog. I'm going to navigate down and select this image. This is a friend of mine, Toby Denny, and his wife Shirley. I wanted to do a conversion for them as a gift, and so I grabbed this photo off of Facebook. It was very low resolution. It was only like 200K. Basically, I would generally recommend that you start with a much higher resolution image than this, but no matter what the resolution of your image, I would say always start your conversion with an image of the same size and dimension of all the previous conversions you've done. It should be a high resolution image, but specific. Be specific about the pixels per inch and the dimensions, and use that every time you do a conversion. For me, I always upsize or downscale, whatever it is, the image to 300 pixels per inch and approximately 8 by 10 size. It doesn't have to be exactly that. If I hadn't done it yet in this case, I would go up under Image, Resize, Image Size, and change the resolution here to 300 pixels per inch, and the longest side, make that 10, so that it's approximately 8 by 10. It doesn't have to be exact. You'll notice that's approximately 3,000 pixels wide. And the reason I recommend you start all your conversions with an image the same size and dimensions is so that you can gradually learn progressively as you do more than one image conversion how much certain shifts will affect the depth. You can gradually get a feel for how many depth slices you're going to want to make and how many pixels you're going to want to shift each depth slice. And these are terms that I'm going to be explaining in a few minutes. Don't get overwhelmed here. Excuse me. So always start with an image of the same size and dimension. For you, it may not be 300 pixels per inch, 8 by 10, but that's what it is for me. The reason I chose that is 300 pixels per inch is a good print resolution, generally understood to be a good print resolution, and 8 by 10 is about the largest that personally I figure I'd ever anticipate wanting to print something. So there, that's my reasoning. You can choose your own size and dimensions for your own reasons, but be consistent so that you can learn progressively. Now, it's worth mentioning also in this early stage that any touch-up work you're going to want to do to the image, you should get that out of the way first. And I'm not talking about correcting color or contrast or saturation or any of those kind of things, because those can easily be done once you have your completed stereo pair. But any touch-up work, by that I mean correcting blemishes, cleaning up dust spots, patching up scratches, reflections, glare, anything like that that you look at an image and you go, gosh, I've really got to clean that up and get that fixed. Get that out of the way now before you duplicate and begin work on the image, because you don't want to have to double your efforts. If you end up with the conversion done and you have a left and a right eye image now, that's not a good time to do this kind of touch-up work, because then you're going to have to do it in both the left eye and right eye and double your work. So, depth slices. Let me explain what I mean by that. We're going to imagine the image in 3D as one of our preliminary steps. You have to kind of study it a little bit and figure out what is the closest foreground object. In this case, you might think at first it's the front of this table, but if you notice, Toby's got his right leg sticking kind of forward here, so his leg is actually the furthest foreground object. And we're going to envision slicing up the depth in a series of incremental depth slices. What I do is I envision a giant sheet of glass, if you will, coming straight down from the sky, maybe an inch or two behind the window, behind the frame, and ask myself, what is going to be sliced off by that? If it was a totally razor sharp sheet of glass that had the capability of cutting through anything. And of course you don't have to imagine the blood squirting everywhere and the guts spilling all over the floor. Just imagine this glass slicing into the scene 1 or 2 depths back from the window, and ask yourself, what is going to be sliced off by that glass? And that is going to be your first selection, or your first depth slice. And since we've said in this case that it's Toby's leg, I'm going to go down here and select what I would say is, an inch or so of his leg in the foreground. And that's our first depth slice. Now, what selection tool did I use here? My favorite selection tool is this polygonal lasso tool. You have these ones here that are like square and circular, and then you have other things like a magic wand. But when you hold down the mouse button over this lasso tool, that's the default lasso tool, by the way. The default lasso tool you have to do in a single line. It's kind of limiting. And this magnetic lasso tool automatically tries to interpret the closest line that you're drawing around, but you can see it does a poor job. It's already starting to chop off parts of Toby's head here. So my favorite is the polygonal lasso tool. It's a very manual tool. In other words, it lets you have complete control. You click to start, and then you have this line that you can move anywhere. I'm just going to click again here. It completes that line and gives us another line that we can click again. You just keep clicking to draw your selection line until you get back to the original spot. So there's our first depth slice. Now the next step is to save that. I always recommend that you save your selection lines. Up under the select menu here, you have an option called Save Selection. Give it a numerical name. Use 3 digits, 2 if you want. It depends on how many depth slices you ultimately expect to do. I'm going to just leave myself an allowance here and go 001. And if you want to be more descriptive and call that Toby's leg or whatever you want to name it, it's totally up to you. And then that saves it. So then under Load Selection, you can load that again at any time. And that puts the selection lines back. So let's say, for example, we had the image closed for the night and we opened it again tomorrow, and here it is. We want to resume. We want to get that selection line back again. We just go under Select, Load Selection, choose the one we want. In this case there is only the one, but there would be a list here if we had several saved. You can save as many as you want, and then OK, and that brings those selection lines back. So you're not saving the image itself through that. You're just saving the selection lines. You also, of course, want to save the image itself frequently. Up under the File menu, you'd initially do Save As, and this saves your entire project. You want to always use, as you're working on an image through the conversion and you're saving the entire project, you want to use Photoshop format. PSD is what that will look like. And that will save any layers. If you've used different layers, it'll save all your selection lines that you've saved, and it won't use any compression. So that's the best way to save if you want to save the project at the end of the day and resume it on another day. But any change you do to the image, you want to do both of those. You want to save your selection lines, and you want to save the image itself, either with Save As or Save. So now, after we've done this selection of our first slice, we're going to have to shift it. We're going to remember we're moving objects to the right because we're working in the left eye image. The original image is going to be treated as our right eye image, and what we're working in is a copy of the image that will ultimately become the left eye image. So every time we move something or shift it, it's going to be a shift to the right, and that will bring that further forward to the foreground. Anytime you make any shift to the right in the left eye image, that brings it further forward. Before we do the shift, you have to make sure you're viewing the image at 100%. Here it says 25, and we want to make sure and view it at 100%. So before we do our shift, we're going to hold down Command and Option and hit the number 0. Now we're viewing it at 100%. And what 100% means is not that you can see 100% of the image, because obviously we can't. We're only seeing a portion of it. But it means that we're viewing the full size of the image. It means literally that for every screen pixel, we're seeing one image pixel. For every pixel of your monitor, there is only one image pixel, one pixel within the image itself. And when you do your shifts, for every tap of the arrow key that you move an object, you're wanting to move it by one image pixel, but it's actually going to be moving it by one screen pixel. And to make sure that you're consistent, you want to make sure that one screen pixel equals one image pixel. So you have to view it at 100%. So, doing the conversion as you're drawing your selection lines and doing your work, you might view it at various sizes. You might go back, zoom it out. You might zoom in really, really close, 300% now, to get real accurate with selecting around something. And that's fine, but just every time you're ready to do your shift, when you've got your selection lines drawn and you're ready to shift them, go back to viewing it at 100%. So Command Option, and I'm on a Mac computer again, so Command Option and the number 0, and that brings you back to 100%. So we're at 100%, and we're going to want to move this. Now, another thing to discuss here is that many conversion artists will cut up every selection that they make and remove it, put it on a separate layer, and end up with a multi-layered image that has every depth element or component on its own layer. And I don't do that, and there are advantages to doing that. I'm going to be trying that in the near future, but the main benefit of doing it that way and cutting everything up onto its own separate layer is you then do have much more control over the arrangement of the depth, the setting of the window, without cropping. You can set everything behind the window if you want. You can go back later and replay with it and adjust the different layers to set the depth, the degree of depth that you see between objects and where they're placed in the depth environment. But what I do is generally, I want to get the conversion a little bit done quicker. I'm not about spending weeks and months on an individual conversion. I have sort of a desire for more instant gratification. I want to be done with a conversion the same day or maybe the next day, within a few days tops. So I'm not going to spend weeks or months on a conversion. And one of the ways that I save time in doing my conversions is by using the method I'm about to explain that I call the drag smear shift. Drag smear shift. When you cut out something and move it, if I was to cut out this area here and move it a little bit to the right again by a few pixels, what's going to happen is it's going to leave behind empty space. When you cut something out, the background is white, and you're going to see a sliver of white along the left edge of this where I moved it from, the area left behind. And ultimately that's going to be a hell of a lot of work polishing that up and filling that in manually. You're going to have to use the stamper tool, the cloning tool, and very intricate, delicate work, time consuming. What I do to overcome and avoid most of that unnecessary work is this drag smear method. Now, what I do is I hold down the Option button and the Command button, and I tap the right arrow key. Now watch, when I hold down Command Option, notice the cursor changes. The cursor, it doesn't matter where it is, it can be up here, it can be down here, it doesn't matter. But you're just going to hold down Command Option and tap the right arrow key. I'm going to tap it twice. You may not even notice those movements because they're so subtle. 1 pixel is really a very small amount of movement. Progressively, it's going to be more and more. I'll explain what I mean by that. But the point of this drag smear method is by holding down Command and Option and tapping the right arrow key, we didn't leave behind, notice, any blank area. In fact, it's barely noticeable that we did anything here at all. And the reason for that is by holding down those keys as you tap the right arrow key, you're doing a cloning of the area. It's essentially taking what you see in this area and cloning it as you move it. So if you're only tapping the arrow key once to move it by 1 pixel, then along the left edge, since we're moving it to the right, it's the left edge that we're concerned about, the image data that is 1 pixel deep within the inside of that selection area is going to get cloned. And so as we move along, you can barely even notice that we've moved it at all, and the area left behind is automatically filled in. So that's a time saver, and that's what I do. Now notice I'm still working on the original layer. This is our layers tablet over here, and I have not created a new layer for that depth slice. I'm still working on the original single layer. So that's our first depth slice. We've selected it and we've moved it, shifted it. So now we're ready to go and do our second depth slice. So you study it, you go back to your selection tool, your polygonal lasso tool. Now here you have to make sure before you begin cutting into the second depth slice that you have this here selected. It's called Add to Selection. You notice when you have the selection tools activated, you have these options up here, and the default here is called New Selection. And with the default, if I were to try to click in and create my second depth slice, what happened? It erased my original selection lines, and I don't want that to happen. So I need to choose Add to Selection, and that enables me to create a new depth slice. I'm cutting into the depth of the image, in other words, another inch or two, but I have not erased the original depth slice. So now I have a selection area that includes both the first depth slice and the second depth slice. So then once I've done that, and I've determined that, you know, the second depth slice is, in this case, it's only going to be part of his leg, part of Toby's right leg again. The table I'm figuring is still a little bit further back than that, so I'm not selecting any of the table, just a little bit more of his leg. So that's my second depth slice with my first depth slice included in the selection. Excuse me. To remind you again, at this point you would want to go and save that selection and name that number 2002, and you can be more descriptive than that if you want. You also want to go back and save the image, the entire project I mean, and now you're ready to shift it, right? So what do we do again? We have to make sure we're viewing it at 100%, remember, so Command Option number 0, so we're back at 100%, and then I'm going to do Command Option right arrow for another 2 clicks, and that once again moves it to the right, doing the drag smear shift, thereby cloning the edge of pixels along the inner edge and automatically filling in the area that normally would be blank, that would be left behind. So there we have 2 depth slices selected and shifted. Now, doing the conversion, this is a process of incrementally choosing these depth slices as we cut deeper and deeper into the image from the foreground, working back to the background. I'm going to go and show you this here. I put together, in this one, I did this conversion. It was a total of 24 slices that I did. And here's a little video that just shows those incremental slices. First, second, third. Now we got the table involved. More of the table, more Toby, cutting into Toby's arm now. A little bit of his knuckles there, going deeper up at his arm. We got some of Shirley's side going into this now. Gradually we're cutting deeper and deeper into the image, working our way toward the background. This isn't perfect. I'm just kind of doing my best, as I go through, just eyeballing it, doing my best. I did this conversion fairly quickly, 3 or 4 hours I think I devoted to this. And after 24 of these depth slices, each one being moved, being shifted by a couple of pixels at a time, and each incremental selection including all previous incremental depth slices, we finally reach the end here where we've got all 24, and that's the end. That's the end of the conversion. So since each incremental selection is enlarging the selected area and including all the previous selections, then every time you do a shift, every time you move, you are moving your new selected area once, but you're also adding another shift, another pixel of the shift to your earlier selections. So when you're done, ultimately the first selection you did will have been moved the greatest number of times, and the last selection will have been moved the least. And that's going to push everything out of the image. You'll end up with a giant window violation, and you'll have to set that back, and to do that you'll have to use Stereo Photo Maker and open your converted image as your left eye and your original image as your right eye, make it a stereo pair, and then adjust the window. I won't explain that here now, but most of you probably already know how to use Stereo Photo Maker, and you probably already know that doing this, setting an image back behind the window, requires cropping. Stereo Photo Maker does that automatically, but it crops the left and right sides of the image in order to set it back behind the stereo frame. So one thing I should have mentioned in the beginning is that it is important in doing this conversion method that I've taught here that your image be slightly larger than you need it to be, that there be some left and right image data that is disposable or scrap. So sometimes I'll even just expand the canvas of the image, make it a little bit wider on the left and right sides, anticipating that ultimately I will need to set the window back and I'll need to have some disposable image data that can be cropped off. But if you start with an image that is just a little bit wider on the sides than you will need it to be ultimately, then that will accomplish the same task. Again, if you were to cut all of your elements, all of your selections, and put them on separate layers, then that gives you complete control to manipulate the stereo arrangement and the stereo window to where no cropping ultimately would be necessary. So that's one of the benefits that's espoused for that method, which again I haven't tried yet, but I anticipate trying sometime soon. So that's the basic method that I use, and I hope this was helpful for you. So I'm going to sign off now and say have a great day.